Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this meeting of the Corporate Committee on the 10th of March. I'm Councillor Peter Mitchell and Chair of the committee. First of all, please note that the meeting is being filmed for live broadcast and subsequently available on the Council's internet site. I think it would be a good idea if we introduced ourselves first of all. So can I ask colleagues to introduce themselves? Can I start this way?
My name is Fiona Alderman. I'm the Council's Monitoring Officer and Head of Legal and Governance.
I'm Jack Booth, Principal Committee Coordinator.
I'm Benita Edwards, Council's Head of Legal.
Councillor Dimage, West Green.
Councillor Emery, Muswell Hill Ward.
Councillor Barbara Blake, Seven Sisters.
Minesh Jani, Head of Audit and Risk Management.
Thank you very much. And other officers will be joining us online and will introduce themselves as they join us. Councillor Ejiofor, would you like to introduce yourself as you missed the round?
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Joseph Ejiofor, Bruce Grove Ward.
Thank you. So item 2, apologies for absence. We have apologies from Councillors Barnes, Berryman and Ibrahim. Yes, Councillor Demir.
I received a message, apologies for lateness, from Councillor Amin.
Thank you.
Also from Councillor Blake.
Thank you very much. So item 3 is urgent business. I don't believe we have any items, do we, Jack? No, thank you. Item 4 is declarations of interest. Do any members have anything they need to declare? No, thank you. Item 5 is deputations, petitions, presentations and questions. I don't believe we have any requests, do we, Jack? No, thank you. So that brings us to item 6, which is the minutes of the meeting held on the 1st of February. Are those agreed as a correct record? Yep, okay, thank you very much. So that brings us to item 7, the Treasury Management Strategy Statement. This is the update for quarter 3. Tim Apofa, could you introduce yourself and introduce the report, please?
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, everyone. My name is Tim Mpofu. I'm the Head of Pensions and Treasury here at Harringay. And the report I'm introducing this evening is the Treasury Management Update Report for the third quarter of 2021-2022. The report is for members to note, and it is the Council's Treasury Management activity for the quarter ending the 31st of December 2021. And the report is included in Appendix 1 to this cover report. The report itself is just for information only. It does not require members to make a decision today, but I'd also like members to just note that all the Treasury management activities included in this report were undertaken in line with the approved Treasury management strategy. At this moment in time, there isn't anything particular in the report that I'd like to bring to members' attention, but Chair, I'm always happy to take questions on the contents of the report if there are any from members.
Thank you very much. Do members have any questions? If not, maybe I could just ask a couple of questions to you. Obviously, this is quarter 3, and it perhaps illustrates that some things are moving quite fast. So, reports on Bank of England interest rate and the CPI inflation rate, both of which, of course, have gone up since this report was written. And I just wonder whether you felt that that those trends would have any particular impact on our Treasury management strategy?
So I think, yeah, that is a good question. I think the trends are something that we're keeping a close eye on. At the moment in time, I don't think there is anything from the trends that suggests we should deviate from our current strategy. Particularly on the borrowing, as you notice, we do take both short-term and long-term borrowing. The short-term borrowing tends to be cheaper and the longer term borrowing tends to provide us with the cost certainty. So I think we are keeping an eye on the markets, but you're right to point out that it is fast moving and it's been quite volatile in terms of the rates we've seen over the last 2 weeks, for example. So what we just try and do is take advice from Alan Close, keep an eye on what's happening in the economic environment, and where there are any opportunities for us to maybe take some more longer term borrowings when the rates fall, we do so. And if the rates are a bit high, we tend to go for the shorter term borrowing and look for opportunities later on in the year.
Thank you. Can I also ask about the UK Infrastructure Bank in paragraph 4.8? Is this something the council's likely to look into, given that the interest rates are a little bit lower than the Public Works Loan Board?
Yeah, so it's something that we have discussed with our Treasury advisors. It is something that I think we'll be interested in, particularly on some of those projects where they require infrastructure. I think the issue with the Infrastructure Bank at the moment is it takes quite a long time for you to sort of go through the process of getting the loan. So at the moment, we prefer the PWOB because it's much easier, much quicker to access. But it's something that we are reviewing with Alan Close. If we were to go through the UK Infrastructure Bank, we'd bring a paper to this committee and just provide an update as to how exactly that would be undertaken. But just to advise members that it does take a considerable time from the application to actually receiving the funds.
Thanks very much. And my final point is about borrowing with costs. In paragraph 5.10, you note that they have been lower than budgeted, and you suggest two factors: lower interest rates than predicted at the time, and slippage in the capital programme. I mean, are those the two factors essentially that do contribute to this underspend?
Yeah, so those are the main two factors. I think historically, when we started the year, we're still in a sort of COVID environment. Rates were lower. In terms of our capital program, we actually have higher interest rates assumptions embedded into the forecast themselves. So that's how we set our budgets. But over the course of last year, up until very recently, the interest rates have been relatively cheaper, which has been a great opportunity for us to take on some longer term borrowing at lower rates than we'd previously forecasted for. Going forward, obviously, that's unlikely to be the same. So you might see that there'll be a peak in terms of the cost going forward. But over the last year and over the period that we are sort of presenting this report for, that's been the main contributor to the underspend.
Okay, thanks so much. Councillor Emery.
Thank you for that. Just on that point you made previously to the one that the Chair just raised, the one on the UK Infrastructure Bank, you said it would take a little bit longer to process these loans. Can you give an idea of timescale on that?
I think it just depends on the project, but initially you'd have to make an application, and once that application is processed, I think it might take anything from like 3 to 6 months to be able to see the process from start to finish. But there are a lot of things that you need to provide beforehand, so there'll be work that we'll need to do in the background before we actually put forward an application for us to be able to receive those money. And for the UK Infrastructure Bank, they are prioritizing projects that are investing in infrastructure or in renewables. So yeah, we'd have to have that evidence upfront as part of the application before we actually got approved, and then it'll take some time to receive the money as well.
Is the Treasury aware of these limitations?
Yes, so they did do. Sorry, yes, so they did do a consultation when they launched the bank, and essentially how the bank has been launched, it will be available to a lot of other public sectors, but they've used like the local government at the moment as the first test. So I think there is another council that's already taken money from the Infrastructure Bank, and I think it might be somewhere up north. I'm not sure which one exactly. So they are sort of sampling it out. One of the other things we've also realized is the sizes of the loans might not necessarily be big. So in the scale of our capital program, where we've got quite big needs, we might want to take out a big chunk of money. At the moment, they're looking at projects from anything from 5 million upwards, which again would not be worth the effort in terms of the money you get and how much work goes into it.
Thanks for that.
Thank you. Are there any further questions? No. Well, thanks for that.
Sorry, I have a question. I don't know if you can hear me. It's Councillor Rossetti.
Okay, Councillor Rosetti. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. I'll just switch on the video so people can see that it's actually myself. Yes. Okay, I have a question on section 7, the revision of the CIPFA code. And in this section, there is a list of possible changes to the reporting code. And he said that it's not clear when this new code will basically take effect and this new kind of reporting will start. And it's mentioned is deferred until 23-24. So what I wanted to check is what kind of impact this can have on our reporting, and in case how long, if at least there has been an estimate of how long it could take for us to be ready to report in according to the new code. Thank you.
Yes, so yeah, thank you for your question. So the Prudential Code is actually effective at the moment. It is going to take, essentially the CIPFA approved the code in December. And because the code is the one that drives how we set our investment, our treasury strategy, there wasn't enough time for councils to be able to implement that strategy before the end of this financial year. So at the previous meeting, I presented the Treasury Management strategy statement for the next year, which has now been approved. That was based on the old code. So they have made a provision for us to then start from next year when we are going through the process of setting up our new Treasury Management strategy. We'd have to do it in line with the new code. So in fact, from next year onwards, we'll be kind of looking at seeing what the different requirements are. On a high level, one of the main things that they've done is they've just made it stricter in terms of what you can actually borrow for. So you're not able to borrow to invest, and they've got a definition in terms of what they consider to be an investment. So you can borrow for treasury purposes, such as if there's a shortfall in liquidity, you can borrow short term. But you can't borrow and, for example, go and buy a supermarket or another asset that's not a core function of what the council is. So yeah, there are a few things that have been included in there, and I think when we're setting the next strategy, we'll provide an update to members. But because at this moment in time, we're not sort of in line with the new strategy, we haven't provided an update as yet.
Councillor Rosetti, you're on mute.
Thank you. Sorry, just to follow up on what you said, this the level of borrowing that we are seeing and we will see in the next year, would that be compliant with the new code? Yes, it will. Okay, thank you. So some of the activities that the new code prohibits, we've not been undertaking those activities anyway. Like investment. And in many ways, the new code will actually be in line with how we've been managing in terms of making sure that we borrowing when we need. We don't borrow too in advance of need, and we're keeping our cash balances low to make sure that we don't have that extra sort of cost of carry where we've got the money, we're paying the interest, but the project is not yet being delivered. So I think those constraints, they are just asking councils to be much more, to keep a closer eye on how they're managing that. Thank you very much.
Well, if that's all the questions, the recommendations are in paragraph 3 on page 11. So the committee is asked to note the Treasury management activity undertaken in the first 3 quarters of the financial year, and to note that they were all undertaken in line with the Treasury Management Strategy. Is that agreed? Agreed. Thank you. So that brings us to item 8, which is the Audit and Risk Service update for quarter 3 on page 27. So I'll invite Minesh to introduce that.
Thank you, Chair. I'll just quickly go through the report, highlighting the key points and then take any questions, if that's okay. Oh. Sorry, just go. Okay. So the key highlights. This is a regular paper, and as the Chair says, it reflects the work of audit and counter fraud team in quarter 3. That's October to December 2021. The key highlights. I've highlighted the fact that COVID has continued to play its part in impacting on the delivery of the audit plan. Members will recall that last year there was a delay in starting the audit plan as the authority responded to the COVID impact. Quarter 3 was a good quarter for gaining momentum and getting back into the regularity of audits starting and finishing. And we've achieved that in Q4 as well. So I'm hopeful that we will get delivery of the audit plan by the time I report fully on all the audit work, all the audit work in July later in the year. In terms of changes to the plan, I've highlighted 2 audit areas that have been added to the plan and 2 where the audits have been postponed to the next year. The 2 audits added are 141 Station Road and the Opportunity Investment Fund, and the 2 schools postponed requested the audits be delayed because they had a vacancy at the school business manager level, which I've agreed to. The next stage is I'm reporting on 3 audits that were completed: IT capability management, accounts receivable, and the payroll audits. IT capability management and accounts receivable both were classed as adequate levels of assurance. Payroll was assigned limited assurance. Just focusing on that, the reason for the limited assurance relates to 3 factors. First is the payroll system is actually quite cumbersome, relying significantly on manual processes, which in themselves tend to create risk. One of the risks that was identified is that levers are not always removed in a timely manner, which could basically impact on a number of different elements of council operations. It's really important that as people leave, they are removed so that we stop their access to council systems, as well as make sure that the amount that they are going to be paid is calculated correctly. The second reason was the payroll process isn't fully mapped out. That in itself isn't necessarily the biggest risk, but it gains a little bit more prominence when combined with the first risk, which is that actually the system is cumbersome. So a cumbersome system, when it's not fully matched, increases the risk profile. And the third area was the fact that the system doesn't calculate annual leave online. So the risk is, as that is done manually, there may be errors, omissions in how annual leave is calculated and taken. Just to inform the committee that our work on the grants continues, but is now moved from proactively looking to ensure that the grants paid are calculated properly and are correct to basically post-event assurance work. And this is where we are being asked by BAYS to carry out checks on payments that have been made to ensure that the payments were correct. Moving on to the regime for follow-up, this is an area that I wanted to strengthen this year and to report to the committee on a regular basis. And it relates to how audit recommendations raised previously have progressed, whether the recommendations have been implemented and to what degree. I'm reporting on 3 audit areas where we'd assigned limited assurance previously: adults brokerage, children's brokerage, and declarations of interest. I'm pleased to note that for adults brokerage, 5 out of the 6 recommendations raised have now been implemented. For children's brokerage, we noted that 2 out of the 3 recommendations were partially implemented and 1 was outstanding. And that seems to relate to sickness, which has delayed the implementation of recommendations. It's one area that I wish to follow up on simply because that area was assigned limited assurance. So it's important that the recommendations raised are implemented as quickly as possible. And the last area was around the declarations of interest. In this instance, 6 recommendations had been raised previously. 1 has been fully implemented, 2 partially, 2 not implemented, and 1 is not applicable. Again, we plan to follow that up again to make sure those recommendations are implemented. A quick word on the counter-fraud activity. We have 2 key performance indicators for the work of the counter-fraud team. We've recovered 20 properties thus far, to the end of December, to the end of Q3. and 39 right-to-buy applications didn't progress following intervention from the anti-fraud team. These numbers are slightly lower than what we plan to achieve each year, but slightly better than last year, and impacted upon significantly by COVID. The final piece of news is I've reported for a number of cycles that there were 2 investigations which had been referred to the police relating to tenancy fraud. I'm pleased to report that for one of the earlier cases, which was due to go to trial, the defendant has now changed their plea from not guilty to guilty, and will be taking next steps in regard to that. Chair, I'll pause there and take any questions.
Thanks very much, Minesh. Are there any questions from members? Councillor Barbara Blake.
Sure. So what that relates to is monies that we've received that we've not been able to allocate to any individual debtor account. So that money is then held in suspense with a view to trying to identify the debt to which that money should be assigned or apportioned. That hasn't happened, and it goes back to quite a long time. The implication there being either people have paid us in error, or that actually that money is owed to us but just needs to be reassigned somewhere. But it is rather aged now, and that is the risk that the auditors are highlighting.
Can I just raise a question on the payroll audit, which, as you say, got limited assurance? I think what concerned me was that, according to the Mazars report on page 39, it was also limited assurance at the previous audit. So one question is, how long ago would that have been? And the other thing that surprised me about the Mazars reference is that it took a very long time between the date of the audit, which was June 2021, and the final report, which didn't appear until January. I mean, is that because there was some dispute over the findings?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, a point well made around payroll. But, so I am aware that the payroll service is looking to implement a stronger regime around the operations of payroll. And that, I think that the fact that the systems as they are, are inherently susceptible to error, last year as well as in the current cycle, is a reflection of how the design of the system is. So I don't think that recommendation, or the assurance rather, will improve up till the point that there have been some significant changes to how the payroll function is operating. So there's quite a change that's required there. In terms of the timeline and how long it's taken, Chair, if I go back and just look at the reason why that was, I can't recall it being a discussion of any length between the auditors and the service, but I think I just need to go back and double check why it took so long. Okay,
thanks. And I had a query about the anti-fraud cases. I mean, every time we have this report, I mean, there are always a substantial number of cases ongoing, over 200. And is this just because of the sheer volume of work in trying to investigate these cases? And so is my other question, paragraph 14.7 says that 114 of these cases are with other teams, either legal or tenancy management. So is that because it has reached a certain stage, and it's it's clear that either it's working towards a prosecution, or I don't know, in the case of tenancy management, what their role would be, why a case would be handed back to them? Can you just give us a bit more information on that?
Thank you, Chair. So yes, quite right, in the sense that the cases have been investigated and a proposed recommendation raised with either legal or with Homes for Haringey for how those matters should be taken forward. So in effect, one of the steps that often arises from these actions is for the tenant to be served a notice to quit, because the tenant actually isn't living there, they may be living elsewhere. And so the fraud team, there's a hard partition between the fraud team and the service responsible for the management of this. So the fraud team will raise the recommendation, pass that recommendation back to the service for the service to then carry out the necessary steps. So that's what that relates to.
Okay, thank you. I think Councillor Rosetti, you've got a question. Do you want to come in now?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, it's on the Q&A, which was attached to this report, and it's on page, what it is? It's on page 2, and it's the audits at fieldwork stage, and those are the 21-22 audits. And I'm thinking in particular acquisition and disposal of assets and New River Leisure Centre. I was wondering, since this is a fieldwork stage, when we can expect to see the reports issued. Thanks.
Just can you clarify, Councillor Rosetti, are you looking at the Mazars report, page 38 of the pack, yeah?
Yes, the Audit Q3 Progress Appendix A document.
Yep, okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Rosetti. So specifically for the leisure audit, that is actually at fieldwork stage now, so I would anticipate that being finalised by the next meeting that we have in July. And the other audits that are highlighted are provided for information, so the committee is aware of the stage at which each of these audits is at.
And the one I asked about the acquisition and disposal of assets, is there any sort of timescale for this audit to be released to the committee?
Next cycle, sorry, the next meeting, Chair.
Ah, even this one, thank you.
Yeah, yeah.
Are there any further questions? Councillor Demir?
Thanks, Minesh. Just three quick questions for just information purposes. 14.2, the local performance measures of anti-fraud activity due to right to buy. The 4 million financial figure, how is that arrived at? Is that the discounted value of the property that we could have potentially sold to a tenant who, through the, with right to buy, has been prevented?
Thank you, Councillor Demir. So the financial value for the recovered properties, that's based on a CIPFA estimate of £18,000. So what CIPFA have done is, in their view, and this figure goes back a number of years now, so actually, if anything, it's gone up, what the cost of each unit is to the local authority for it not being available to us to use as we would wish, i.e. to house tenants. So if somebody who shouldn't have that property is actually residing in that unit, it's costing us £18,000 per annum. So that's where that figure comes from. And then the right to buy, that figure is based on the discount value. So essentially, each property that we sell, with the discount given of 125,000, I think, equates to that 4 million.
And just a quick follow-up. On the no recourse to public funds section on page 34, sorry, I've just lost it, 1 sec. Yeah. So in Q3, 14 referrals were received and responded by the anti-fraud team. Can you just tell us a little bit about the outcomes of those? Thank you.
So, Councillor Demir, what the arrangement that we have is essentially a two-stage process. So where people present themselves needing no recourse to public funds, the team responsible for that within children's services, adult services rather, do the assessment, and where they believe they need more information because of inconsistencies or some queries that they have around the veracity of the information that's being presented to them, they will then ask the fraud team to carry out some further checks and respond back to that team for them to decide what to do next. And we had 14 of those in Q3.
On a positive note, I was pleased to see that the schools audits, we have 4 received a substantial assurance, and all of those were an improvement on the previous audit. I mean, is this hopeful signs of the sort of training and support that's given to schools is showing results?
Thank you, Chair. I think so. I've come to this committee on a number of occasions and highlighted the fact that a lot of our schools receive quite low levels of assurance, and that was certainly true, maybe not last year, but the year before that and prior to that. And I'm really pleased to see that the efforts of the council, which includes the services within finance as well as children's services, and of the auditors and the risk management team, to inform schools of the sorts of controls which are necessary for good governance, and for advance warning schools of the sorts of controls that we would essentially want to test, so that the schools have the right governance in place and are aware of the control measures that the auditors would seek to rely upon. I think it's paying dividends. There's a bit of me that it just wants to hold back a little bit, because all the schools audited and the higher levels of assurance have all been derived in the COVID period, where the auditors have not been going to the school as they used to in the past. So I'm just going to hold back a little bit, if I may, and try to reach a firmer conclusion next year when I expect the auditors to be going to schools.
Well, thanks. Okay, that's a good point. Are there any further questions? In that case, the recommendations on page 27, paragraph 3, committee are asked to note the activities during Q3. So is that agreed? Thank you. So that brings us to agenda item 9, which is the annual internal audit plan and strategy and charter, and that's on page 43, which is over to you again, Minesh.
Thank you, Chair. So this item has 3 parts to it: the audit strategy, the actual plan, and then the audit charter. The audit strategy looks at what internal audit does, so it's based on the what audit does, and that is based on the organizational priority. Based on the organizational priority, and the objectives that the organisation has in its borough plan, and it considers this via the role of audit, how the service is being delivered, and the planning processes, and there's a little bit more explanation around that on pages 48 to 50. What that leads to is the actual plan. The plan this year, I think I will have to update and bring to you in its entirety back in July. And that's simply because what I've done in the plan is highlighted the areas of risk and the bits which are most important for the organisation to get assurance upon. But the big elephant in the room is the transaction with Homes for Haringey coming back in June. What I'm proposing to do there is that when that happens, to carry out a fresh review of risks around that, and to reassess the audit plan to make sure that we capture those risks within the audit planning process and bring the fresh plan to this committee back in July. So that's one area of uncertainty at this stage. And the way I've shown that is by including 100 days in the plan for Homes for Haringey, just in its totality, rather than splitting it amongst the different areas and functions of Homes for Haringey, as is at the moment. The actual plan is shown, just to refer to that, is shown on pages 51 onwards. And you'll see that it's essentially divvied up into the key operations of the council, with an emphasis on the cross-cutting and corporate areas of the authority business. And that has the largest proportion of audit days assigned in the plan. Just to mention a few words about the audit charter, I bring this to the attention of the committee because I think the committee needs to be aware of and endorse the charter, in the sense that it's the how internal audit carries out its work and sets out essentially the principles under which the public sector internal audit standards are applied in the delivery of the audit work. I'll pause there again, Chair, and take any questions.
Thank you very much. Councillor Emery.
Thank you, Chair. Minesh mentioned in an email on the 23rd of February that the audit of purchase cycling, management of contract registers and early years commissioning are in the 22-23 audit plan. We can't seem to find the management of contract register. Just wondering what happened to that. And we're just wondering, in terms of these items, obviously 22-23 can be quite a long time away. I'm just wondering if you can update us on whether that was going to cause any issues long term with that.
Thank you, Councillor Emery. I think, did you say the management of the contract register?
Yeah, the management of contract register.
Yeah, I think that's on page 53, second from bottom.
Okay, thank you for that.
Any further questions from the committee? If not, can I just raise a couple then? So on page 51, one of the areas is, well, in fact, the first one is community engagement. And I just wondered if you could give a bit more information. Is this looking at all the different occasions when we might be seeking the views of residents? Is it, for example, those that are aimed at potentially everyone across Haringey, for example, when we consult on the borough plan or the local plan for planning purposes? Or are we also looking at specific proposals where we seek views which are probably more restricted to particular localities? For example, if we consult about a CPZ or low traffic neighbourhood, for example. So can you just clarify what you see as the scope of that particular one?
Thank you, Chair. So the purpose of this audit is to take a holistic view of what it is that the authority does with regards to engaging with the community on a whole host of things. So it's trying to establish what is the overarching framework under which the council carries out its operations when it consults. And it could take any form. And I think what we'll do is, at the time of the audit, take a sample of a couple of schemes and just see to what level engagement was undertaken. But essentially, it could be any of the examples that you quoted. The idea being that it's to try to establish what that framework looks like and how effective that framework is.
And on page 52, third one down is missing children service. Could you just clarify, is that children who should be in school but are not, but their whereabouts are known, or is it actually children that we don't know where they are at all?
More the latter. So this is to look at the arrangements that we've established where it becomes known to us that a child may be missing. So what are the steps that we take to try to identify where the child is?
And just wanted to be clear then about acquisitions and disposals of assets, because it was in the previous report that we discussed as being in the current year's programme. It's in the Mazars report, but it also appears here on page 53 for the programme for the coming year. So is that because you see that piece of work stretching over both financial years?
Thank you, Chair. So we're going to do this audit twice. We're doing this audit as part of this year, and we are testing a sample of transactions that have happened in this financial year. This committee has raised a number of questions around our arrangements for dealing with acquisitions and disposal. So with that in mind, I'd wish to carry out the same audit again next year, but with a fresh set of transactions that happen next year, to provide assurance to the organisation as to how effective our governance arrangements are when acquiring or disposing of assets.
Thank you. I was looking back at papers, and you often report that particular issues are added to the internal audit programme in the course of the year because of particular issues or requests from directors. So, for example, back in July, it was reported that health and safety was being added to the plan for the current year, but it's now in the plan for the next year. And I'm not sure whether that's because in the end it didn't happen during the current year, or whether this is looking at a different aspect of health and safety.
Thank you, Chair. It is actually looking at different aspects of health and safety. So the audit that's in the plan for this year is looking at the operations of how we deal with health and safety in the authority. The audit for next year is looking at the system that the team plans to implement and the effectiveness of that system in making sure that we are maintaining the regime around health and safety in the authority.
Thanks. And another one was hospitality and gifts. I think that was in the report to the November committee as something that was being added as an advisory audit, but it doesn't appear to be in either your update for the current year or indeed in the plans for this next year. So can you just say what happened to that?
Thank you, Chair. So we have completed our work on hospitality and gifts. I suspect it's not appearing on the appendix for the Mazars work because we carried out this piece of work in-house. And it was an advisory piece of work, as you say. So the essence of this piece of work was to advise the authority on how to make our arrangements, and this is the officer hospitality and gifts system, how to make that arrangement more robust to capture any hospitality and gifts and for the arrangements to be properly reported within the organisation. So that was its purpose, but I suspect it's not showing because we did the piece of work rather than Mazars.
Thanks. Thanks. Are there any? Yeah, Councillor Emery.
Sorry, just to follow up on the question I was asking earlier. In terms of that specific part of the plan I was referencing, which was to do with the management and of control of contract register, when do you think this will happen in 22-23?
Thank you, Councillor Emery. I think the thrust of this is that there were 2 or 3 audits that we had in the plan for this year that we've had to put back into next year. And the reason we've had to do that is because many of the steps that needed to be taken this year just haven't happened so far. And those steps relate to my previous report to this committee or reports to this committee, identifying some gaps in our arrangements for contract management, the letting of contracts. The service has taken those points on board seriously, and they intend to carry out a holistic review. Because that hasn't progressed as of yet, the audits that I planned for this year have gone into next year. My intention is that as soon as that arrangement is put in place, I'll start the audit straight away. And so I'm not able to give a firm date, but I can give assurances to this committee that it will be as soon as the appropriate systems have gone in place. And the only reason for doing that is because I fear that if I was to go and audit now, I would only report what I've already reported previously, which is that the governance arrangements are weak.
Can I just ask a question about the charter? On page 58, sort of introductory page, summarises changes that have been made to this charter over a number of years. The version 1.5, it says the implementation date is March 2022, but the review date is February 2022. So is that correct? How can it be reviewed in advance of implementation?
Sorry, Chair, I think what I was trying to say there was that the charter was reviewed in February 2022, and once it's come to this committee and signed off by officers, it will be implemented from March.
All right, thank you very much. Are there any further questions from the committee? So the recommendations are on page 43. So we're asked to approve the updated annual internal audit strategy and plan for 2022-23, and also the internal audit charter. So is that agreed? Great, thank you. That brings us to item 10, which is a verbal update on the 2020-21 audit process. So welcome to David Eagles from BDO.
Good evening. Thank you, Chairman. Just a verbal update this evening. We had intended to bring our completion reports to this meeting, but whilst we've made some very good progress in a number of areas, there are still a few things outstanding, which I will talk you through as I sort of present this evening. I think the key thing is that we also have a developing national issue, which is also relevant to Haringey, which has a quite a significant impact upon the timelines that we're reporting to, and that relates to the valuation of infrastructure assets, which are required to be valued at cost less depreciation. The issue that has arisen is effectively it's not a new issue, but it's a new way of having to look at it. And the key point is that when new capital expenditure is incurred on infrastructure, and this is basically roads and street furniture and so forth, when that new expenditure is incurred, it is often to replace something or to refurbish something. And what should happen, as part of the accounting treatment within the Code of Accounting Practice, is that the old cost and accumulated depreciation is written out and then replaced by the new capital expenditure. And in summary, that writing out hasn't happened. It hasn't happened in Haringey, and it hasn't happened in pretty much any council across the country which has infrastructure. So the positions we have with that are, or the consequences are, that if an asset is replaced at the point where it's got to the end of its useful economic life and it's been fully depreciated, then we just have an overstatement in the notes to the accounts of gross cost and gross depreciation that should have been written out, equal and opposite, but with no net book value. But a sort of a worst case scenario is where assets actually haven't got to the end of their useful economic life and there is some residual value. And that means that when we don't write things out, actually we leave a net overstatement of net book value. And we think that's also happening in quite a number of situations. So, for example, where streetlights are replaced with the sort of old traditional bulbs, they're often replaced much sooner than the useful economic life would have suggested, because it's good to get the new LED bulbs in place. So that sort of situation could lead to an overstatement. And it's something that, as I said, is common to pretty much every infrastructure holding council in the country. And those issues, because the level of spend each year on infrastructure is quite significant, often individually material in each year, it's very easy to get to a material problem very, very quickly. And that's what we again think is the case in Haringey. We have taken this issue to the National Audit Office as part of our Local Auditors Advisory Group, which I sit on, and also the Local Government Technical Network, which a colleague of mine sits on, and actually I sat on again this afternoon to outline the position. And in summary, all auditors and the National Audit Office and CIPFA recognise that there is an issue. So it is mutually accepted that we have a point to sort out. We have taken papers to those groups to talk through. We have taken other supporting potential qualifications through to that group to see what's going on. Yesterday, the CIPFA LASAC board, who are responsible for setting the Code of Accounting Practice, took a paper to consider. So CIPFA are working on potential solutions, potential amendments to the code, which would work retrospectively to deal with that. But that may not necessarily entirely remove the potential that we may have to issue a qualification, because the records are kept on a basis where it is pretty much impossible to untangle the position to calculate a clean and materially accurate position completely in compliance with the code. It's a very unusual situation, but just to let you know that all opinions relating to infrastructure holding councils are currently on hold from all suppliers. So it is a very serious issue which we need to address. If the code is amended, it's going to take at least 2 months worth of process and consultation to get that far. And I think that's being optimistic. So in terms of the timescales that we're hoping to report to you, and having missed the March slot, we're aiming for July. We are hoping that the solution to that particular issue will be available by the time we come back to speak to you in July with the conclusion of the audits. So quite a serious issue. The reason it's come up this year is basically because there have been continual increases in quality reviewer expectations about what we're doing here. There have been audit quality review findings which have specifically pointed at the need to do more in terms of infrastructure impairment reviews, and the consequences of if there is something is that you would need to do some writing out, and therefore we'd have a problem again. But also it's important to note that one of the audit firms was served a sanction by the Financial Reporting Council only a month or two ago for a failure to deal with refurbishment costs actually of housing stock, but it's the same basic principle. And they were levied a fine after reduction of £250,000. So it is a very serious consequence to get these things wrong, and that's why the firms have paused those opinions coming through. So it is unfortunate, but I think in terms of the revised reporting lines for Haringey, things may come together so that we'll have the whole picture sorted out by July. And in terms of the two main audits which we're undertaking, of course, we have the audit of the main council. The key issue in terms of timelines there has been the sheer volume of work we've had to do on the valuation of property, plant and equipment. It is always a significant risk area, but there are significant volumes of issues we have to look at. And again, continuing pressure from quality regulators to do even more this year than we've had to do in previous years. But there are also larger than normal samples on sort of cut-off, again, partly a different way of having to approach things, and also in terms of testing on the bank. And the last issue in terms of the main audit, which I wanted to bring again to members' attention, we have referred to it previously that there were some issues with IT general controls work. There was a number of areas where we had some problems identified, and that's crystallised in a number of different areas, including on reports from the authority's Northgate system, where previously we've been able to rely upon system generated reports, but because of the issues with the IT general controls, we've not been able to do that. But we have been working with officers to come up with a solution, a way of working around that particular issue to try and prove that there hadn't been an issue from ITGC issues. And we have a report now to work through, but it's several hundred lines of information which we need to work through to cover the various different people who had access rights that had been causing concerns. So the good news is that we have found a way of working our way through that and around that particular issue, so it doesn't become a potential qualification area and an area which we couldn't audit. But it is taking time to do that, which I think we said was potentially going to be the case when we reported a couple of months back. In terms of the pension fund, just for completeness, I think the key issue there is that we have, again, been making some good progress. However, all of the information which we needed to complete the work at the very beginning of this year, sort of January, February time, didn't actually come through in time for the auditors to complete that. But we have now got that to work on. There are a number of sort of queries which have been sort of passed back in terms of investment work, which we understand are being in the process of being answered. And finally, we had just to update, we had a meeting with the actuary today, which has cleared a number of outstanding queries in respect of that work. And finally, to say we've had some access issues in terms of systems access for testing pension benefits. But what we agreed and arranged is that we'll actually come on site next week to address that particular issue, to work around those access points. So in summary, we are not reporting this time, as you will understand. We are aiming for July reporting. There is a large and unusual national issue which is relevant to Haringey in terms of infrastructure assets. And in both the main audit and the pension fund, lots of good progress, but still some work to be done before we get to that point of conclusion. And I'm more than happy to take any questions on any of the items I've updated on this evening.
Thanks very much for that update, David. So can you just clarify then, this national issue that you described, which is obviously a very significant one, has that arisen because there have been discussions and questions about audit practice? Well, I mean, why hasn't the issue been challenged before? If you say, you know, almost every local authority didn't do what is now being considered good practice.
It's got a long, it's got a very long history actually. So one, as I said earlier, it's infrastructure assets are valued at cost less depreciation. Pretty much everything else actually has a valuation attributed to it. And a few years ago, an attempt was made to try and attribute valuations to infrastructure assets, but ultimately it was abandoned because it was just too hard. So being able to value roads was really quite complicated, because even small variations in the dimensions of the road over a course of a few miles could actually have significant variances on valuation. So it's been left at one level. The code requires the sort of cost and the depreciation to be written out, but most authorities don't do that. There is a sort of a shortcut way which the code describes, but people aren't doing that either. And actually it's got some holes in it. I mean, the key issue is that I think probably there was an expectation that things would have been resolved with the valuation point, but it just wasn't. And it's been, I suppose, mutually accepted as an acceptable position. However, the quality regulator has been pressing for significant improvements over the years in terms of the way that they consider we should be undertaking and documenting audits, and this continued pressure has, I suppose, come together with a sort of a perfect storm. So we have bar raising in terms of valuations work. Things that were best practice 2 years ago are now no longer accepted. They are not sufficient. We have to do more work, and I've said that that's certainly the case in terms of the traditional PPE valuation work. There's more things we have to look at in different ways. The issue with the other supplier having prompts in terms of refurbishment accounting was another factor that came together. And as I said, also other quality reviews which are particularly pointing at concerns about impairment reviews for infrastructure assets from the regulator. So if we take the three things together, it suddenly puts you in a position where if you cannot find a suitable answer for the position, and we can't, then we cannot ignore it. So once the issue has been raised, we have to pursue that through to conclusion.
Thanks very much, Do members of the committee have any questions? Okay. Well, thank you, David, for that update. And yeah, we'll obviously look out for the audited accounts, hopefully in July.
That's right.
Thank you. Thanks very much. So that brings us on to item 11, which is the public right-of-way application. This is Bryce Tudball. Bryce, would you both introduce yourself and introduce the item, please?
Thank you, Chair. Bryce Tudball, Interim Head of Planning Policy, Transport and Infrastructure. So I'll just quickly introduce this item. It's about a public right-of-way application for a privately owned pedestrian route in Crouch End that runs between Mount View Road and Dickinson Road. And by way of important background, this pedestrian route was closed in summer 2021 via the erection of a gate. Public rights of way are highways that allow the public a legal right of passage, and they can be created through a number of different routes. The route in question is not currently a public right of way, and an application was submitted to the council in August of last year under the relevant act to make it a public right of way. The law sets out how these applications should be processed and determined. So there was an application form submitted by the interested party. The landowners were notified. Evidence was submitted by the interested party in support of the route being a public right of way. The council subsequently wrote to the landowners in relation to the application, and they subsequently responded contesting that the route is a public right of way, stating that it's private property and no public rights of way exist. And in relation to that, they submitted some evidence to the effect that it's not a public right of way. Now, the key test in relation to it being a public right of way is that it's been in uninterrupted and unhindered use for 20 years. And this is the starting point when looking at the evidence from both parties. Having assessed the evidence of both the applicant and the landowners contesting the public right of way application, weighing up those two pieces of evidence, it's considered by officers that likely to be the case that the key test is not met. So it's a balance of probabilities position. It's also important to note that benefits of the path to the community in terms of providing access to services, amenities and facilities are not something that should be taken into account in terms of the determination. It's a simple case of where it meets the legal test. And just to repeat, the legal test is around 20 years of uninterrupted use. So the recommendation for officers to corporate committee is to reject the application. And just finally to note, if corporate committee does agree with that recommendation to reject the application, then the applicant does have the right of appeal to the Secretary of State. Happy to address any questions and queries. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks very much. Are there any questions from the committee? Councillor Mark Blake.
I just wanted to ask if officers considered getting some independent legal view on this.
We haven't sought an independent legal review, but we have consulted extensively with the council's own legal team in relation to the recommendation and the consideration of the evidence in that regard, Councillor.
I mean, it seems to me we've got conflicting statements here, haven't we? I think there were 6 residents who state that, in their view, it has been an uninterrupted path for at least 20 years. We have another resident who said they used it for a long time, but they do say that there were gates at some time. They don't give a date. And then we have a couple that actually don't cover 20 years, so that doesn't really add anything to the evidence. So on the one hand, we've got some residents, but not all, saying they've used it for more than 20 years. But we then have representatives of the freeholders giving a different view. I mean, it certainly seems from their statements that there was a gate until 2005, and then it suggests that there was a period without a gate until quite recently, but if there was a gate until 2005, then clearly no one can establish a 20-year uninterrupted use of the path. So I mean, it just seems to me we've got completely contradictory statements. In your view, is that then, or in the legal view, is that sufficient grounds for saying it's just not clear, and so we can't be certain that the test has been met?
Thank you, Chair. So as I said, it's a balance of probabilities thing. There is no way of being certain. So you're comparing the two bodies of evidence. Having been through both bodies of evidence, we note inconsistencies in relation to the applicant's own evidence within the user evidence forms themselves. And I note also strong evidence that's been provided by the landowners to indicate that 20 years of uninterrupted use has not been the case. There's a variety of things they've provided, historical letters, historical correspondence, historical records, pictures of the gate in situ, although we don't know when the photo was taken, and also photos of private property signs have also been shown, which have been acknowledged through the applicant's own evidence. So on balance of probabilities, the officer views that the test has not been met.
Certainly, it seems that the pictures of the gate don't really add anything, because there's no date, so we don't know when that gate was in place. It's not the gate that's there now, that's for sure. But yeah, it certainly does seem to be the case that we have a series of inconsistent statements. So, are there any further questions from the committee? Councillor Barbara Blake.
So, why did the owner decide to close the path after all these years? I must have missed that in the papers, but could you just, what made the landowner make this move?
Thank you, Councillor. So I can't give you the exact reason. I would be able to speculate. I think there's been a wish from the landowners for leaseholders for some time for the gate to be put up. There have been some concerns indicated around antisocial behaviour along the route and general nuisance. So to speculate, they may be the reasons, but their actual reason is immaterial to the decision at hand at this evening of the committee.
Councillor Emery.
Chair, if you look at page 162, you can see a semi-answer to your question, Councillor Blake, because you can see that they mention the fact that they need to put a gate up in 2006, the letter's dated. Otherwise, they'll hit that 20 years public right-of-way route. So it looks to me like it's the same kind of issue again 15 years later. That would be my guess.
Thank you. Any further comments, questions? In that case, can we move to the recommendations on page 68? So the first is that we've considered the documentation, which we have, and then recommendation 2 is to reject the application to make an order. So are we agreed on that? Yeah, agreed. Thank you very much. Thank you, Bryce, for that. So that brings us to item 12. I don't think we have any new items of urgent business. No. Item 13, dates of future meetings. For those of you who might be around in the new year, the first one should be 21st of July, not 22nd of July. Otherwise, those dates stand for the next municipal year. So in that case, thank you very much for your attendance, and close the meeting.